I'm going to talk a little bit about using color in Illustrator. And I have a rectangle here, which has a white fill and a black stroke. Now, we know that we can change the color by clicking on the color panel. Again, all you have to do is click on this color ramp here, but if you want more options, make sure you click on Show Options, and that allows you to change the CMYK values of whatever color you have here. And that is actually pretty straightforward. Again, you have the option of no fill, black fill, white fill, or any color you choose. One other option, there's also a swatches panel that allows you to store the colors. So if you decide you might want to use this color in several places in your document, to maintain consistency, what you can do is click on the little flyout menu on the top right-hand corner of the color panel and click on Create New Swatch. And you can either leave the swatch name as at its CMYK components, or you can give it a name. And it will add it to your swatches panel right here. Now in the swatches panel, there's a few options here for colors. And one of them is, if I double click on this color, I will just show you here. One of the options is to change it into a global color. If it has a little triangle on the corner here, that means it's a global swatch. The great thing about global swatches is, let's say you've used it in several different places in your InDesign or your Illustrator file, and you decide at some point that you want to change it. So I'll draw a little rectangle here, same color, and I'm going to deselect both of them. Now, ordinarily with colors, if I wanted to change the color, I'd have to select it. But I have 200 little squares of this color in different places in my document, and I decide it's just a little too yellow, I want to change the color. The great thing about global swatches is if I double click on it, I can change it. And when I click OK, you'll notice that everywhere I've used that global swatch, it's been updated. So global swatches are a really great way, first off, to maintain consistency in your document, and secondly, to give you the option to change it quickly if you need to. Okay, I just want to also mention that there are different swatch libraries, plus you can actually import swatches from one document to another. The swatch libraries are under this little flyout menu here. When it says Open Swatch Library, you'll notice that there's actually quite a few different libraries here. One of them is color books. So if you're looking for a Pantone, say, coded color, Pantone solid coded, that will bring up a little dialog box here, a little menu here that shows you all the Pantone colors. And you can click on one and double click it to add it to your swatches library. Notice it's a slightly different icon there for Pantone than for the global swatches. The other thing you can do under this menu is you can click on there, go to Open Swatch Library, and if you have some swatches in another document and you decide you want to use exactly the same swatches in your current document, if you go to Other Library at the bottom, it will allow you to navigate. So I actually have one on my desktop called Swatches. And if I click on that and click Open, this is actually just an Illustrator document that has some different swatches added to its swatches panel. This is the swatches panel from that other document. And I can click on these and add these swatches, just drag them to my current swatches panel. And now I've added the swatches from that other document. So you can save swatches that way. Okay. You can also do that with other swatches. One of the quickly going to talk about gradients in Illustrator. If you go to your swatches panel, you'll notice that there are some gradients here. I'm going to select this orange and yellow gradient. Now the gradients are controlled by the gradient panel, which is right here. You can see this is how this works. This shows you that it is a linear gradient. If I click here, I get a radial gradient. Click here, you get a freeform gradient. We're going to talk about freeform gradients in a minute. So I'm there because they're something completely different. This little color bar here shows you the colors that are used to make this gradient. So there, it actually goes from yellow to orange. These are all actually separate colors. So if I click on them and pull them off, you can see I can remove sliders. I can move them around. I can add sliders, which gives me a bit more control over it. I can double click on the slider, which brings up the color panel, and I can play around with the colors here. So I add a more vivid red there, or I can make something completely different. Again, if I decide that's a mistake, I can yank this off. The little diamond here is the halfway point, and so that tells you exactly, it shows you where the colors will actually break. You can see if I move those diamonds closer, I get a sharper transition. Gradients can be saved as swatches. So if I select this gradient here and then go to my swatches panel, making sure I have my gradient selected here. You can see this is the gradient preview. And I can now add this to my swatches panel. To go back to the gradients, you can also control the gradients using something called the gradient annotator, which is right here on the tool panel, about near, just sort of around the middle near the bottom. And this is this line here. Now you can actually control the colors, and this is something that it was new and fairly new in Illustrator. You control the colors here. I can actually double click on this color and change it if I want to change it to something else directly, and you'll notice that it changes it over in the gradient panel too. I can also click the gradient annotator and drag it to change the angle of the gradient. And you'll notice with gradients, the further I drag it, the softer the transition between colors. If I click it and drag it a short distance, basically where the first time I click it, that's 100% the first color. When I release it, that's 100% the second color. The distance in between is the distance that Illustrator has to redistribute those colors. So the further I drag it, the softer the transition between the colors in the gradient. Again, I have, same thing works with the radial gradient. If I click on here and select the middle one, that gives me a radial gradient. Again, you can see the angle doesn't really matter with radial gradients, but the distance does. A couple of other things about gradients. You can also change the opacity. So I'm going to peel a couple of these off here. So now I have a yellow to orange gradient. And if I click on this one, you can actually make them transparent. Now I've actually put a little graphic behind the square so that when I reduce the opacity, you can see the orange fades out and now the background is showing. This blue bar is in the background. And you can see as different degrees of transparency. And as I change the little diamond, you can see that also changes where the transparency changes. So that's a transparent gradient. I'll change that back to 100%. Now the freeform gradient, which is the third little square here, is something completely different here because it allows you to add these points. So I can draw extra points there, or I could actually even draw a line here and go across here. And essentially, I can have a different color at each of those points. So I'm going to go back to points here, and if I double click on this, you can see what happens when I double click on each of those and add a different color. So the freeform gradient allows you to distribute your gradient in all kinds of different ways, depending on where you draw the points and lines. It's actually pretty interesting. I can see that we probably won't use it that often, but it is an interesting way, and I can see that it would be useful for some illustrations. So that's the freeform gradient. I think this was new in either the 2019 or 2020 version of Illustrator.